101 with Santa.
Yeah. I have those two. I have a lot of things to fiddle with on my desk. Like I even got like
Show me.
I got
What's that? Is it a Gundam?
a Gundam. Yeah, I got a
Uh-huh.
few of those. I always have about 2 sets of dice on me, just in case. And you'd be surprised how often it's like, oh yeah, do you have any dice? Could you do a quick roll? I'm like, I shouldn't be surprised.
Actually, it's worse than that. And I've lost my camera. Sorry.
Yeah, no worries.
That's what I get for pulling things around on my desk. It's so covered in junk. And that's the smaller bag of dice.
Yep. I also have I always keep the pinks. For some reason, I am so lucky when rolling these. When with any other dice, I'm horrible. As weird as it sounds, I know it's all in my head, but these dice I've always succeeded with. So I only...
well, interesting. Here we go. Anecdote number 1 of 528 about dice, about D6s. I read something fantastic on Daka years ago now about a guy who basically he taught engineering, as I recall it was. So we had a bunch of grad students, and he said, "All right, we're going to do some stuff with probability. We're going to roll lots and lots of dice together," because he was actually a 40k tournament player. He was just interested. So we got bucketfuls of the standard GW D6s, 12 mils, I think they are. Like thousands of them, and shaker tables, and got them to record the results. And he also did it with a number of other sort of like different makes of dice. And what he found was the GW ones got about 23% ones. Now, if you know your mathematics, you would know that it should be about 16%.
Yeah.
However, the casino dice that he was using, they got kind of bang on the line for about 16%. And he did various other ones like rounded corners, square corners, all this sort of stuff. Casino dice have square. So I read this with kind of mounting horror, and I've not used those kind of D6s since. And I have to say, I feel like my results have been suspiciously better. So beware of what dice you actually use, I think is the bottom line of this story.
That I'm going to blame
shapes,
that on my
certain weights.
That is...
Well, you can do that too, yes.
That is very interesting. Now I have someone to blame whenever I roll ones. It's just the dice.
You can blame the man keeping you down. Forcing you to buy more expensive bespoke dice, you say. Your camera's gone out of focus, by the way. You also did something to your camera, I think, in that scrabbling around for things on our desk.
I find with how this program works is sometimes you'll have a delay on the image, but it records it without any delay. It's just, it does that in order to limit bandwidth so that you don't have, so that the voices and the audio come out clearer in the end.
Right.
If you know what I mean.
It cares more about the audio, is what it boils down to. Oh, that's fine. Yeah. There's no delay. There's no delay. You're just slightly out of focus, but it may be just like giving me a bit of a, as you say, a small bandwidth image from your end at the moment.
Yeah, it might just be always weird. Gotta love technology. But here, I'll start the intro since hello, RP people, and welcome back to another episode of Role Playing as Smart People, the podcast where we pretend to know what we're talking about when it comes to all things tabletop. My name is Santa, and thanks for tuning in. Joining me today, I have Andy frickin' Chambers. Now, if you don't know who Andy Chambers is, it's the guy on the screen right there, of course, but he's done so much. And again, not trying to butter you up like in the intro, but seriously, thank you for coming on. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thanks for asking me to come on today. Social media I'm bad at, so talking to people is the best way I can actually get my ancient face out there these days.
Come on, you got such a pretty mug. Don't even worry.
33 years this year. 33 years I've been working professionally as a game designer. So if it feels like I've been around for a while, that's why.
That is an insane amount of time. So how did you first get involved in the tabletop hobby as a whole?
Way back. Okay, back through time, 70s. My dad used to be into building like balsa models of
Hmm.
aircraft, big ones, like
Yeah.
1/12 scale, stuff like that, flyable as well. Um, and through that, he was kind of interested in modeling in general, and I was kind of interested in that sort of stuff too. I love my little Airfix figures and stuff like that. That you used to get then play sets of like British Commandos versus German badly molded guys. And because of that, he started buying me a subscription to a military modeling magazine,
Oh.
which was a very kind of like pipe and tweed kind of a publication, uh, which had a lot about sort of like properly painting your Napoleonic hussars and things like that, in big scales as figurines and so forth. But there was some war games material in it as well, where people would do a battle report every now and again about a
Mhm.
scenario they did of like Viking raiders coming along and raiding the Saxons or something like that. And it really kind of spurred my interest a lot. And also, just at that time, that you were starting to see some adverts for science fiction and fantasy figures. Not a lot at all, but kind of in the classified ads, there'd be some Medusas and stuff like that in there, and it was starting to creep in, and D&D was starting to creep in as well. So it was just starting to pick up as a more than just a complete aside into Jason and the Argonauts or something like that. The fantasy was a thing.
Mhm.
Valley of the Four Winds and all stuff like that started to come out. So I kind of started getting drawn into it that way. And at the time, there were a few different wargame shops in Nottingham,
Hmm.
including one called Asgard Miniatures. And I took my little young ass down there and just kind of got really drawn into it there because it was like spaceships and
Mhm.
sci-fi and coolness.
Yeah.
Um, and as a kid growing up, I'd always been really excited by things like Captain Scarlet and Thunderbirds that you get on British TV. Loved all the vehicles and stuff like that. So that plus World War II, between the two of them, kind of propelled me forward. And eventually, I ended up getting a job through people I knew who, went to the Asgard War Games Club and stuff like that. Some of them worked at Citadel as well. There was a fair
Mhm.
amount of cross pollination there. I mean, Jez Goodwin was miniature designer at Asgard Miniatures at the time I was there. And I got a job in mail order, working for Games Workshop back in the late 80s. And did a couple of stints there, like over Christmas periods, because
Yeah.
they obviously had a lot of mail order on, and that was working out in the factory in Eastwood. Um, but again, I got to know people. Some of the people from there actually transitioned to go and work in the studio. Not me. I went and smashed myself up in a motorcycle accident and got laid up for a year.
Oh.
And at the end of that, over the course of that, I actually wrote 2 sets of War Games rules and painted about 3 armies. Um, and by the end of it, I really wanted to do something, and
Mhm.
I started getting into 40k. I started before that. I started getting into 40k, like Rogue Trader. And about the time I just about recovered and I was back on my feet again, I'd started getting into Adeptus Titanicus, which I found fascinating. This like game in a box, because
Yeah.
everything before that, you bought a book or a booklet. It usually
Mhm.
was like little thin pamphlet sort of thing for rules, or occasionally you get big chunky books. But role playing had advanced a lot faster
Yeah.
because D&D had become big news and people were doing big role playing books and stuff like that. But the tabletop wargaming stuff was still just running around in that period. So the idea of a game in a box where you got the rules, you got templates, dice, miniatures,
Yeah.
different weapons for your miniatures, buildings, was amazing to me. Absolutely amazing. I loved it. So really got into playing that a lot. And I started buying metal stuff that was coming out for it from Games Workshop as well, like blisters of Baneblade tanks or what have you,
Mhm.
and painting them up. And I had these blisters of like little Titans. They were marked as being one-man Titans, but there were no rules for them. And I
Yeah.
was looking at White Dwarf, and they were pretty good about putting rules for stuff in White Dwarf when
Mhm.
things came out. It's one of the reasons I liked them. It's like, huh. So And I heard why there were no rules for one-man Titans, and it was because Jervis Johnson, who designed Adeptus Titanicus, had gone on sabbatical. I got to learn the word sabbatical at that point for 6 months, which means going and doing something else for a while. So they had nobody to write the rules. And I was like, with the confidence of youth, I understand the rules, and I'd been kind of like adapting sets of rules and like writing my own and playing about with that sort of stuff for years by that point, despite my youth. So I wrote an article in the style of White Dwarf. So it had a little bit of background and some little quotes in it and all this sort of stuff, and did stats for them, in the system that I already knew, so they'd work with the existing models that were in the range. And so submitted it, heard nothing for a little while, and eventually they called me in and into the studio, which was in the middle of Nottingham at the time in Enfield Chambers. And they said, I quite like your article, why don't you come in for a couple of weeks and, finish your article up here and we'll see how you get along. And I was like, all right, you don't need to ask me twice. And I was in, and I tried to be as useful as possible. Very much so. And the first lesson I got when I landed there, which is an important one in professional game design, was that my article went straight in the bin. Because, well, for one, actually day one, when I first arrived at my desk, Jervis Johnson was back, and I was like, oh, well, that's me done then, isn't it? So, he's literally like across the desk from me. And the second one was that they had a load of background and stuff like that for these one-man Titans. Not one-man Titans, knights, as we know them now.
Yeah.
Night worlds, night houses, all that stuff. They had all that background. They just didn't have the rule component to go with it because Jervis hadn't been there. But they've been able to do all the rest of it. So they basically just entrusted me to do the rule component on that and a bit of the sort of like connecty bits.
Yeah.
Because you get like pure background, pure story and stuff like that. You get pure rules, and sometimes you need a little bit of a connection between the two of them. So I did that, but then was immediately deluged with a ton of other stuff to do for White Dwarf, for Epic. More tanks. We did like an organizational system for like building your own companies that would later see full reign in Space Marine and Space Marine 2nd Edition when Rick did those. So, 2 weeks sort of turned into 3 months, turned into 6 months, turned into a year. At which point they were sort of like, well, I guess, you really do have a job, don't you? I can't even remember what the name of my position was when I was first taken on, writer or something like that, I think. And I just tried to be as useful as possible. And I ended up taking photos as well. Weirdly. I had, when I went to school, I did graphic design, like higher national diploma. I never went to college, as Americans call it, at university here. So I had a bit of basic grounding in like cameras and stuff like that. The guy they had taking photographs at the time for White Dwarf, Chris Colston, lovely guy. But at the time, he was not a gamer. So he'd set up sort of like nice, moody looking scenario sort of shots, but with the miniatures sort of scattered about and flock in all of their bases very carefully to make it all look as realistic as possible. And that was nice and all, but A, they needed a lot more photographs doing than that. It was taking too long. And B, they kind of wanted to have like shots of games in progress because they never look like a game in progress. They look a shot of a bunch of miniatures on a nice background with some nice trees or what have you. I was like, all right, I can do that. Once again, confidence of youth. And piled in, and I told you about anecdotes, didn't I? Back then, no digital photography, folks. Try and imagine a world without digital photography at all for a moment, because it didn't exist. So we were literally using like, the big bellows type cameras you see in the oldie worldy westerns. That was the kind of camera you'd use to get a good sort of decent exposure. They call them plate cameras because you can slide in a photographic plate at the back, expose the film, take your snap, big flash things to go off as well, blind you every time, and then go off and seriously process the photograph, and then turn it into a bromide that can then be attached onto the paste up sheets that you send off to go and get printed. Paste up. fuzzy felting, as it was called at the time. So all of that. So I was involved in that process and did most of the photography in White Dwarf for about 2 or 3 years.
Oh wow. That
Well,
is,
I tried to drag in other people to do it as quickly as possible because it was an onerous task, I can tell you.
that is
So
that's a
that became
really
something
cool
everybody
story.
had to learn.
Oh, no doubt. That is so cool. So like when I was listening, it sounds like you've actually, for a lot of your projects that you do even after you worked with Games Workshop, it sounds like a lot of them were interests that you even had when you're younger. Like you mentioned, you love vehicles, and you've done quite a few. Well, you've done a few vehicle games, especially
Spaceship games in
spaceship
particular.
games.
Yeah.
Yeah, like
Yes, I have a great weakness for those.
I know, and like I remember when I was looking at models for Drop Fleet Commander, and I
Mm.
saw your name on it. I was like, I I shouldn't be surprised because this is a lot like one of your other games, but like, oh my god, like that's why it's so kind of like cool, and how you feel like it's actually. I thought it was so neat how you would start off in high orbit, you could go down into, was it a sub orbit where you're still up high? And I
It's
was like,
low orbit and then
low orbit.
atmosphere. Yeah, you got
That's
like
it.
3 grades
Yeah.
of it. Yeah, because it's nice and focused. Drop Zone Commander, Drop Fleet Commander, I should say. Drop Zone
Yeah.
Commander's the ground game.
Yes, it is.
And because they'd already done Drop Zone itself, they had this whole thing about having lots of different transports coming in, dropping off tanks and men and all
Mm.
this sort of stuff into the midst of the city. So they kind of had that bit going on, and it was all right. So if we scope out further from that, what do we do? And having already done Battlefleet Gothic at Games Workshop, one of my favourite things I've done,
I
I was
tried to
keen
find
to do another
models.
spaceship game. 3D print, my friend, has
Ah,
the answer to all your woes now. Seriously,
that's so true.
it's been a delight for me because I've seen so much BFG stuff over the last 3 or 4 years, in
Oh,
particular,
really?
as it's become possible for people just to because they can just 3D print their own fleets.
Hmm.
Um, and there's just and that's basically caused a sort of resurgence of interest in it in general, as people can have the fleet they always wanted to have, or have got their old fleet back out again and all this sort of stuff. Which is great to see, and it's still an ongoing thing. I'm delighted people still play it. Some people have updated the rules. There's a bit of a split, as there always is in communities, between sort of like the ones where the players have kind of like changed it themselves and put in some house rules and maybe actually even
Hmm.
reconfigured some parts of the game, which is fair enough. And the ones who are like, no, we will play it as it was written, as it was meant to be, with the
The
monster on the
purists.
mountain. The purists, yeah, exactly. Which is go purists, says part of me, but actually go guys fixing the game that was probably broken in ways that you didn't like, so go for it, says the other part of me. So it's really nice to see all that going on. And yet Drop Fleet was kind of an opportunity to go back to the well in a way and do
Hmm.
another spaceship game, because I thought a lot about doing spaceship games, obviously after doing Battlefleet
Hmm.
Gothic. And the thing that had always kind of bothered me was they're not 3D. Spaceship games aren't 3D.
Yeah.
And if you want to make them 3D, then it becomes, well, a whole extra dimension you have to worry about. And
Hmm.
the question I asked myself at the time about Battlefleet Gothic is like, what do you get for it? What comes out of it? And really, it was a difference in firing angles. It was all I could come up with really for Battlefleet Gothic. And I was
Yeah.
like, it's not enough, is it? Not really. Because then you get into like all kind of roll over and all this sort of stuff, and it's your models don't, and yeah. So I just decided to treat it just like Battle of Jutland, which was always in the back of my head. It was Space Battle of Jutland, and not worry about 3D. But come along to Drop Fleet, and 3D actually was kind of implicit to the environment, because what you
Hmm.
always cared about was getting down to the planet. And if you've got something static like that, you have a planet surface that A, you need to get down to, and B, you can crash into. Then you've got a basis for building in like a basic 3D mechanic, which actually works quite well in Drop Fleet. I was very pleased with the way it came out.
Yeah, no.
Because you also get the atmosphere being this sort of like soup down at the bottom that ships can't really go into, but some can. the atmospheric ones can get in there and go hide in the atmosphere and pop back out and all this sort of
Yeah.
stuff. So it's got some interesting dynamics just straight off the bat, which do actually relate to Drop Zone Commander. So yeah, I was very smug about that one. So
that one was definitely what's the word I'm looking for? It felt the most realistic, I think, out of like, because I've read a few different like space games and all that, because again, space combat is the coolest thing on the planet, and outside the planet, I guess. Uh,
it
and
is.
I remember like looking at the rules and then watching some videos on YouTube of people playing, and I was like, this is just so neat, because you could theoretically have both games playing at the same time in a technical sense.
Mm,
It would be a very, very big game, but it would be a
yes.
really thematic game that I feel like would allow for a sense of vicarity that most games would not really be able to do. Like you would feel like the commander.
Yes.
But
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. And that's one of the nice things to be able to do is to, I don't know, having a couple of different scale games like that and being able to interrelate them,
Mhm.
no matter how tenuously, it's just a fun idea. And it's unlikely that you'll actually play a game like that, except in maybe a big environment like a show or a tournament or something like
Mhm.
that. But just the idea that you could
Oh yeah.
has got value in and of itself, I think, and that's one of the things Games Workshop's missing a little bit these days. I feel like because doing all that work in like Space Marine and Epic and Adeptus Titanicus
Mhm.
gave this like massive grounding that everything else could grow up from,
Yeah.
and it always felt like benefited from making the world a lot larger, the universe a lot larger on that kind of level. And that's why I feel the same way about spaceship games in general. Is like if you're going to have a sci-fi game, you should really have some sort of spaceship game if you can. It's
Yeah.
supposed to be sci-fi, man. How does it all interact? Are they giant, massive spaceships, or are they tiny little fighters? What's going on?
Yeah, and
What's
just
the flavor of your sci-fi?
trying to almost like capture that feel into the game. No, I 100% get you on that. Another
Mm.
one that I noticed you were talking about how you like used to build, or and same with your father, all the like the World War kind of vehicles and all that. Was that kind of almost the inspiration you
Hmm.
also had for Bolt Action? Because I know
Um,
you worked on that one too, and I feel like that almost
I
fits
did
in with your
supplemental
child.
material for Bolt
Ah,
Action. I mean, credit where credit's due. That's Rick Priestley and Alessio Cavatore wrote the core game for Bolt
mhm.
Action. What you're seeing there is all little boys of a certain age, my age, and a little bit younger as
Yeah.
well, and a little bit older, did get a steady diet of World War II when we were young, because it wasn't that long ago.
Hmm.
Scarily enough, I was born in 1966,
Yeah.
so World War II had been over for precisely 21 years at that time. So a lot of the adventure stories and drama even tended to be set in World War II, and
Yeah.
there were a lot of toys and kits and so on that were around when I was growing up. So we all had an interest to some extent in World War
Hmm.
II, and specifically in airfix kits because they were everywhere when we were
Yeah.
kids. They were in toy shops, which was an important definition because while there were a few model shops around, they were a rare beast. But toy shops were all over.
Yeah.
So we all tended to get exposed to it a lot, and so we all had this common connector. And Rick and Alessio, wasn't they? Got out from their Games Workshop days, especially in company of John Stallard, they were all really passionate about airfix kits and World War II and so on, and they wanted to remake the kind of game that we used to play with the old airfix battles rules back in the day when we were nippers. Um, but with a more modern game system, scalable, with things that they'd learned along the way about how you do big scalable systems so they can cover all kinds of
Hmm.
things. And so a very kind of modern take on how to do a World War II game, but I mean it's still very much the World War II game of the movie sort of a thing, as
Ah.
anybody will. Great pains to tell you about Bolt Action is it's not that realistic. But the thing is, you can run around and get your British commandos against your Germans, and raid the Atlantic Wall emplacement
Yeah.
using Bolt Action, and you can do the Battle of Kursk with if you've got enough Russian tanks anyway.
Oh, that's cool.
At the same time with the system, I mean, it'll clunk just like all systems clunk when you do a certain amount with them, but it can take it. It can do it. And it's got some really nice little mechanisms in it as well. So it's a good system. And yeah, when I moved back from the US after working at Blizzard, and landed back in Nottingham, I looked up John Stollard and Rick, and actually no, it was Alessio came and looked me up first, came and found me, because I was freelancing by that time and I was kind of casting about for work. And Alessio came and said, "Well, we're doing Bolt Action, we've done this game." He ran me through a few games of it. It was fun. But we're doing army books, like the old codexes and stuff, and Warhammer army books we used to do at Games Workshop. So I was like, all right, I can do that. What do you need? And he was like, well, we kept it specially for you. He said, we want you to do the Soviet Union book, because they all knew that I was a huge Soviets fan from back at Games Workshop.
Yeah. That
Got a
is
photo around somewhere.
so they actually waited for you to get back specifically for that?
It just sort of lined up nicely for them. What that is me. You can see me somewhere in the foreground in the black leather jacket, standing in front of it's a IS-2.
Oh,
It's
wow.
122 millimeter gun, World War II tank.
That's huge.
Absolutely enormous things.
Yeah.
Enormous things. So I've been like, wow. I can't really get too excited by Sherman tanks anymore when you get something like that around.
It's crazy.
So yeah, it just lined up well for them. And sorry. Yeah,
no, go ahead. Go ahead. I was just going to say, it's always amazing to see those tanks in person. And it's like, you see like them in pictures and all that. You're like, oh yeah, that's a big vehicle. But you see them in real life and you realize the scale of them. And it's almost like.
Better still is if you can see them moving around, like under their own power. Because the ground shakes, man. It genuinely does. Yes. Yes. So cool. You can feel them through the soles of your feet. And it's like, there's a sort of presence there. It's hard to get your head around from just looking at photos or even seeing movie clips of them and stuff like that.
That's so neat. As a Canadian, we have like 3 tanks, so I don't get to see them often. No, I'm kidding.
Well, now, if you knew your World War II, you'd know the Canadians built many, many tanks.
Oh, we did, and we were the original.
And ships.
We're the original stormtroopers, right? That name came from Canadians, because we held the line.
Is it? I've never heard that before.
Yeah, really? I would have to look up the actual thing, but there was a line that was being held, and there was like a section that had Canadians. There was another side that had the French and a few others, and those lines started falling back just from the pressure. And the Canadians, who were actually outgunned and outmanned, were the only group that actually gained ground during that whole time. And after that, I think that was a situation where all of a sudden they're like, oh yeah, you guys are like stormtroopers, because you're just storming those trenches and you just keep on getting further and further and further against all odds. And I always thought that was kind of a cool part of Canadian military history, which we don't really learn about military stuff in our schooling as much. So it was really fascinating to hear about.
Yeah, big role in World War II. And I'd advise any Canadian to read up on the role in World War II. Mm-hmm. Saved our butts in the UK, I can tell you. So, it's true. Yeah. I completely got off base now. What was I talking about? Oh, yes, codexes. Writing army books. From, again, working at Games Workshop, it was just a continuous factory churning out products. Yeah. And writing army books was one of those things where people would grab the one they wanted to do and then look at the pile of other ones and try and figure out who else would do those for them. So there was nothing particularly unusual about going like, oh, Andy's got some kind of like empathy for doing a Soviet book. They'll throw it at him and see if he wants to do it. And it works. So I did.
That's funny.
And subsequent to that, I did some more supplements. I did Empires in Flames, which is about the Far East, Japan, China, Burma, all that sort of stuff. And I did Ostfront, which is more about the Eastern Front, some extra units for that, and different theatre selectors and stuff like that. So yeah, I did do some bolt action stuff, but I don't think of it as being my system at all. I just did some supplemental work for it, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
Which was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Don't get me wrong. I got to use some of my excessive number of World War II books for good cause for once.
Out of curiosity, what was your first game that you could honestly say was like your rule set? Do you have?
That one I wrote when I bust my leg and I was laid up for a year. It was called Firepower. And it was a sci-fi game kind of loosely based on Hammer Slammers.
Yeah.
In the all the weaponry was like 2 centimeter this and 3 centimeter that, all energy weapons and stuff like that. And it was kind of written with what was in the Asgard miniatures range for sci-fi models at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So there were bugs as well.
Oh, neat.
And it had some decent basis, but it was kind of based off some Vietnam rules that we used to play at the time, which is where the term firepower came from. Because they did things by, basically because you're trying to shoot people in a jungle, you basically just picked a frontage for how wide an area you wanted to fire across.
Yeah.
And added up all firepower going into it and kind of like divided up, and that give you a chance of hitting what was in the area. And it kind of worked off that idea.
Huh.
Which is kind of interesting in itself, and very good for jungle warfare in some ways too.
Yeah.
But yeah, I can't speak to the best story actually about Firepower is it was all handwritten.
Yeah.
Because again, remember, this is like 1988 we're talking about here. It was all handwritten and just like in one of these kind of like wallet folders with like plastic sleeves so you can put the pages in. Quite chunky. I'd written a lot, and I managed to leave it on the bus.
Oh.
There's sort of like one existent example of it ever, and you'd have to rewrite the end of like months of writing, and I left it on the bus, lost it, and someone, and again, this is 1988, so your options are limited, and I actually put up some little posters at the bus stop in vain hopes, saying I lost this sort of thing, and I live here, because again, no thought about personal security back then, and a couple of lads showed up at my door and they'd found it on the bus. God bless them. And they brought it back to me.
Wow, that's lucky.
So they had read it as well and enjoyed it. So,
really?
Power to them. Yeah.
Is by any chance that game still in circulation today, or is there any way to find that?
It was never published. No, it was never published. I don't even know what happened to that set of rules in the fullness of time. I just disappeared somewhere along the way, unfortunately. In some ways, I wish I could find it now. In some ways, I'm happy I can't. Because I guarantee you it's bad. Plus, I probably can't read my own handwriting at this point.
God, I have the same issue. I inherited my mother's handwriting, which is illegible to everyone but the person who wrote it. So I know that feeling.
Doctor.
I should be a doctor. Unfortunately, I'm not focused enough. So, out of curiosity, when you're designing a game, what do you think like kind of comes first? Do you think it's more important to put more focus on the narrative or on the mechanics when you first start out?
That's a very tough question to answer because they're so hand in hand to each other. To me, the narrative should be what dictates your mechanics.
Yeah.
To a large extent. Like we talked about Drop Fleet. Okay, narratively, it's a spaceship game.
Yeah.
And it's a spaceship game about trying to land guys on planets. So, ergo, your mechanics should support that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because you don't want to be fighting against your mechanics in your narrative. That's not good. They should work together. That said, though, the mechanics of how I might handle Drop Fleet, I'd kind of come up with them independently because of a different game, Battlefield Gothic, because I had considered the 3 levels thing back then. But like I say, I couldn't see a point to it because as soon as you take away ground, gravity, you're not getting a lot out of it.
Mm-hmm.
So to that extent, there was a mechanic already floating around in the back of my head in regard to spaceship games. It's
Yeah.
just it actually mated very well in this case with the narrative of landing guys on a planet's surface. So, bit chicken and egg really. Which one came first
It,
in that particular case?
okay, that's interesting. Um,
I guess one way to look at it is like, as a designer, you should hopefully always have a lot of different mechanics floating about in the back of
yeah.
your mind. Ones you come up yourself, more often ones you've seen and want to steal off other people, maybe
Yeah.
change slightly along the way. And as you get, a brief, or you talk to the person who wants to make a game, or you want to make a game yourself, or what have
Mhm.
you need the narrative. What are we doing with these mechanics first? Like, if you're going to cook a meal, you need to know what meal you're going to cook before you start worrying about the ingredients. Yes,
Yeah.
and mechanics are. I think push comes to shove, mechanics are more like that. It's like, when I open up my drawer of ingredients, what have I got? So if you're ever in a point where you've got like, I've got a single brilliant mechanic, you're probably starting from a bad place, is the
Yeah.
truth. Because then you're going to try and make a narrative. And only there are plenty of games to do that. I shouldn't be down on them, actually. Where they take a core mechanic and say,
Yeah.
this is the core mechanic, and they build a narrative around it. In
Mhm.
effect, that's perfectly valid too. It's not how I work, but there's nothing wrong with it.
Oh, I've never actually heard of the kitchen analogy. That's a really good way to kind of
Oh,
put
it
it.
gets better. I've got a better
Oh,
kitchen
do tell. You
analogy.
could have a sip of coffee first or tea if you like first.
All right, I'll work my worst first.
Cheers.
All right. Games design mechanics, some people will tell you it's all just mathematics at the end of the day. And games design is just maths. There was a guy at Blizzard who loved to tell me that just because he knew it annoyed me. And the analogy that applies here is that, you need to know the difference between cooking and baking, first of all.
Mhm.
Baking, if you're baking something, there is a formula to follow. Yeah, it's like chemistry, basically. You put in X, you put in Y, you put in Z, put it in for X amount of time, this temperature, this will happen. That's the way that baking is supposed to work. You get a cake, you get a souffle, whatever.
Yeah.
Cooking a meal or a dish is kind of different. It's far more like, I am going to take this particular selection of ingredients, put them together in this way to try and evoke this particular flavor. But there's a lot of variability within that. There's a lot of gut feeling, personal taste, and so on about how you do that.
Yeah.
So to me, games design, pure games design, if you will, is more like cooking than it is like baking. Because while you can take your baking, you take your recipe and so forth, it's very difficult to explore within that space without things going horribly wrong. And most of the times, if you try to do that, try to explore through baking, it will not turn out well.
Nope.
But if you're cooking and you're simply adding flavors, adding spice, adding more meat, what have you, it's a lot easier to make a game that way. Now, you will never get the direct, beautiful sort of like crispness of you baking a cake that way. You will get a meal. But honestly, I'd even go as far as to say that that branch of gaming, as it were, is far more the card game, board games route. Baking is what I mean, where you can do things in a certain way, because you can control the parameters a lot more easily. Once you get in tabletop gaming, it is a lot more like trying to serve people a meal, because they're looking to have a hearty meal, do different things with it that extend outside the basic parameters of, like, I have given you a cake. Does that make sense?
That does
my
make
extended
sense.
Cooking analogy.
that does make actually a lot of sense. And so,
okay, we'll get on to the one about texture later.
Yeah. So, shit. That's some things to think about. So especially when you're working with Free League and the Mutant Year Zero, where you're making a war game out of a role playing game. So how did you manage the cooking and the baking when it seemed like, because you had to almost bake the cooked dish in a sense?
Not at all. What you're doing there is you've got some pre-made ingredients, basically. We want potatoes, we want Swedes, we want carrots, we want meat. Because, as I said to you before you started recording, wasn't it? Yeah, they sent me the books for the role playing game so I could have a read through them.
Yeah.
So I know of apocalypse style settings from my youthful adventures in the wasteland, in Aftermath, and things like that. So, and it's got a really strong flavour to it already there. There's a lot of character already there, and in that case, it's simply working out where the narrative is exactly for a skirmish game. And most of that's already been told. What you're going to do. After that, what mechanics do we use? Different designers have got their different ingredients. They like more and less. I like dice pools as a way of doing things. I think it mitigates the iniquities that you can get from single dice rolls. And it also means that you can handle modifiers more easily because you just roll more or less dice for modifiers instead of worrying about changing the outcomes on the dice. So I like dice pools, and lo and behold, the system they already use for the role-playing game uses dice pools.
Yeah.
More than that, it uses dice which have got some extra symbols on them, so you can basically do things like weapons malfunctioning and psychic powers going haywire on you and things like that. This is already baked into their role-playing game, so obviously, like I say, you steal things wholesale. So it's like brilliant. We have our dice mechanics already worked out for us, and there's always a good argument for doing that because a large number of your players who are going to take an interest in that tabletop skirmish game are ones that are already playing or at least aware of the role-playing game. So give them a set of dice mechanics that they're already comfortable with. Brilliant. Half my work here is already done, really. And beyond that, you just got to work out activations, actions, interactions, and so forth, and you're off to the races. But the other thing that came through very strongly from looking at the Mutant Year Zero stuff was the character of the wasteland that they have.
Yeah.
And the dangers thereof, and sometimes it's just mysterious and spooky, sometimes there's real critters out there and so forth, which is the kind of thing we used to play around with in Necromunda back in the day for 40k. There's hive critters and stuff like that, and we never had a great methodology for introducing them into games apart from like, oh hey, you can have these in games, apart from using like a card-based system that we've done at one stage. So I thought about that and I was like, so what we can do is like have an activation system based on cards was my original proposal. We've got cards in for the different characters, and then you've also got cards in which are for potential hazards popping up. Oh, you managed to run straight across an old unexploded gas mine or something like that. In the end, we went with tokens instead. Same difference overall. And it's a nice little thing because it means every time you put your hand in the bag, you're sort of like, oh, I don't know what's going to be coming out of here. But equally, because it's a random event, in effect, it can either make things worse for you, or it might make things worse for your enemy, or it might make things better for you as well. There are some good ones in there too. So there was a whole extra sort of like narrative thread that came in just because of the environment, which was very suitable, and I think does a lot to help flavour the game. One of the things the guys, Freelagan, Nils and that lot were very keen on was this idea that you would be hunting for salvage as part of the game, going and turning over markers and things like that. So they had a few different sort of like mechanics that they already wanted, which again just made my life a lot easier.
Yeah, no doubt. No, that's really cool. So something you mentioned a little bit earlier that I actually thought was kind of really interesting, and since I would love to get your insight. So you said that because war games came actually before tabletop RPGs, but you said that RPGs expanded further quicker. Was that what you said earlier?
Yeah, really. Because there were a number of businesses that kicked off, TSR most notably.
Yeah.
In the late 70s through the 80s, and Games Workshop Citadel itself, which grew very rapidly indeed. Because the war games market was there and it continued on, and it kind of expanded over that period too, but nowhere near the same sort of speed and scale that we saw from the role-playing market. D&D was seismic at the time. Absolutely seismic. It's hard to
It's
imagine. Well, maybe it's not, but there was just such a dearth of things like it around.
yeah.
And its success basically generated a lot of other game systems that were kind of more realistic and things
Oh
like
yeah.
that as well. Stuff like Chivalry and Sorcery. And a number of companies in the US, particularly, started developing their own systems and selling role playing systems as well. So, yeah, out of virtually nowhere, role playing just blew up
Hmm.
as this major force through the 70s and 80s. And eventually, that sort of like success, I think people who were looking at the war games market, looking at the tabletop industry as well, which was all chugging along and so forth, were like, is there a way to try and make that happen on the
Yeah.
tabletop side of things a bit more too? Um, or just gain confidence that that kind of thing could succeed as a business. Because, let's say, even publishing books back then was a fairly big commitment of time and money to make it happen. Not easy.
Hmm.
To take that a sort of step further and manufacture metal figurines, let alone plastic ones, even further, was again you're getting onto like serious money, like industrial money.
Yeah.
So while there were a lot of like smaller companies with a few casting machines and stuff like that, especially in the UK, especially around Nottingham, ironically, the lead belt as we call it, there weren't any big companies doing it particularly
Oh, okay. And I guess
outside of stuff like Airfix, where it was more model kits
yeah,
rather
it was
than
just a
games.
lot more of a smaller scale. So was I guess during your time at Games Workshop, you kind of saw almost the birth of the modern kind of like war game experience of what it is today, right? Like since they were one of the first, like they are the biggest, but they were one of the first, uh, I would say, international games that really any like me in Canada, I would have heard about it. What
Yeah.
was like being there during that time?
Exciting times, really. I mean, we were working so hard, like constantly just beavering along. We didn't look up too much from our desks on that kind of a level, and also there wasn't that much interconnectivity either. We wrote our articles, we published our magazine, we wrote books and games, and they went out to
Yeah.
retail. We might hear a little bit about like, oh, that was popular, or that didn't sell at all. But overall, we were just doing what we were doing and churning it out. The big growth, the really big growth, if I'm honest, for Games Workshop came. Well, it came in two stages. The first was that idea of the big box game
Hmm.
that I touched on with Adeptus Titanicus, which they continue to do with other games. Obviously, we did big box games through the 90s, two of them a year at one stage. And they got Games Workshop into lots of different places because suddenly, instead of a product range, which was like, oh, yeah, you just need to stock these 24 blisters and this pamphlet, it was a box they could put on the shelf, sell the whole box. And that went down very well, particularly once we did 40k second edition. After Rogue Trader, we did the first big box version of 40k.
Yeah.
And that was huge, absolutely massively popular. I remember them saying at the time that they were going to print 40,000 copies because they thought it was funny. And it had, they were reprinting it like within a week or two, which was unheard of
Wow.
at the time because it just flew out, absolutely flew out. So there was that. First of all, was the products, and a lot of credits there to Rick Priestley, who had a very clear vision and kind of pushed
Mhm.
that forward of the big box games and the Codex Army books and the supplements and so forth. So it got us a good schedule that we could all work behind, and White Dwarf constantly supporting it all as well. And the other one was the expansion of Games Workshop stores, which it didn't hit in America or Canada until later, but certainly in the early 90s through the UK. We'll
Mhm.
get to the point of like there was a town in every store, sort of thing. Every high street had a Games Workshop,
Yeah.
and it started getting really big around that time.
Hmm.
And
Did
yeah, they were in a situation where whenever they'd open a store, it would instantly make the company more money, basically.
wow.
So they were popping out stores all over the place.
Did the s- how like did the culture change quite dramatically as like they started becoming more and more profitable? Like it sounds like at first it was, and I use this more of a lovingly term, but it sounds like a bunch of nerds who are just loving what they're doing. And once you get more and more kind of cash flow into a business, it tends to change the atmosphere all by necessity. But how did the
Mm.
cultures change as the years went on with you working there?
Oh yeah, it changed enormously. I mean, it's very easy for me to look at it in terms of like where we were living in studios at the time. Like
Hmm.
the initial thing in Enfield Chambers for the first 2 or 3 years, I think we were there. Yeah, it was very chaotic,
Yeah.
extremely chaotic, very busy all the time. But yeah, we were all just like charging along, doing our own thing to a large extent, but with a bit of oversight from above. We moved to a different studio on Castle Boulevard in
Hmm.
Nottingham after that, which was a much nicer space. It was a much more open space because literally, like Enfield Chambers was like a couple of corridors, like 3 corridors laid on top of each other with like little rooms off each one. No, the top floor was big, but everything else was just like this warren, basically, which was kind of interesting in its own right, but it didn't promote much communication. Open Plan Office did that, and it also made us much more annoyed with each other all the time, of course. But that's when we really hit full stride.
Hmm.
Was at Castle Boulevard largely for the next, I think, 4 years we were there, and then after that we moved on to the GW main site where Warhammer World is and all that now in Lenton, and the studio moved en masse there. So factory, studio, everything all on one site. And as you might imagine, yes, there were quite some changes with each of those moves,
Hmm.
which kind of reflected the larger changes in the company as a whole.
Yeah. Huh. Interesting.
There's a good non-answer for you.
No, 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 no. On it, it's kind of like I've like a little bit of sides. I'm in school myself for logistics and all that kind of style stuff, and it's really fascinating hearing about the growth. So for a non-answer, it was
Mm.
very knowledgeable. um, and recently, like earlier, you said that you felt like the games at Games Workshop were starting to feel a little stale in their approach. What was the what exactly did you mean by that? Just out of curiosity. If you don't want to answer that, totally fine.
Um, I've forgotten the context in which I said it. To be honest, it was always
We were
best.
talking about how before they had, Titanicus, they had Necromunda,
Oh,
all
oh,
those
yeah,
things,
yeah,
and
yeah,
now
yeah.
it's
Lack of diversity in systems. To be fair, Games Workshop has rediversified itself, but
Mhm.
through things like Kill Team now, and Necromunda and the specialist games. So it's not completely absent. It's just kind of shifted focus.
Okay.
But there was a period um, about when I left Games Workshop when all it was Warhammer 40k, Lord of the Rings,
Yeah.
nothing else. And I felt we lost something during that period, an impetus to sort of like, look wider, do better, think more things,
Okay.
just into the churn of like do things for these three main systems. And that was a logistics issue as much
Mhm.
as anything else. The problem with doing all these wildly diverse other games, all our Necromundas, our Gorkamorks, and things like that, is like there literally wasn't shelf space to stock multiple different games with
Yeah.
their own attendant miniature ranges. There wasn't time to carry on designing new miniatures for games like that and stuff,
Okay.
so that they would eventually get, they'd burn brightly for about 6 months and then be dropped off the schedule because that was the reality. There wasn't
Yeah.
any possibility of doing anything different, or so we were told. So that sort of like led to a shift to just emphasizing the core games,
Okay.
doing new editions of the core games more frequently than we had before, which started to feel very much just like retreading the same things over
Mhm.
and over. As a designer, for me personally.
No, that totally makes sense. You can't focus on a singular project for so long before eventually it starts to feel stale. I
Hmm.
definitely.
I think that's true as an individual, but as a
Yeah.
business, no, that's not true at all.
Oh, as a business, you can't. No, no, no. I agree
Yes,
100% on
as a
that.
business, you actually need to serve your existing customers as well as you can, and all this sort of stuff. So yeah, it's one of those things, and you talked about how companies change over time, particularly as they grow more successful
Mhm.
and become larger. Interestingly, when I left Games Workshop and went to Blizzard, I saw the same thing in action there, where they had been a smaller, tighter team, and they were in the midst of this massive expansion, which is why they got me in.
Yeah.
Like, oh, hey, let's just ship over that Andy guy. He's not got a job at the moment. It's like, okay. Because WoW was doing so well for them at the time. They just had almost literally more money than they knew what to do with.
Yeah.
It was just ridiculous compared to anything
Exploded.
they'd done before. And they'd done really well previously. As software design studios go, they had a really good track record and they had great successes with a number of games, including StarCraft.
Oh, yeah.
But WoW had just like redefined success for them to a large extent. And that's what happens as companies grow. What is a success becomes redefined. Because what the company needs as a success is not necessarily even what individuals like you or me or anybody else would say is a success. So your parameters do shift quite a lot. Yes.
Oh, no doubt. Now, how did you actually get in contact with Blizzard to work on like StarCraft? Like it seems very almost kind of polar opposite in the sense of like I get you're working with a sci-fi setting, but you're going from tabletop to video games. I feel like that it's such a far degree of change between it. How did you get involved? How did you get in contact like this? I need to know these questions.
They need to know. The people need to know. I was always interested in PC games in particular, my Amiga of all things. Through the 90s, I used to diddle around with them a little bit at home in between painting models and things like that and doing other things because I was fascinated by them, absolutely fascinated, because they offer that opportunity, as I saw it, to do so much more than you can do with a tabletop. You can actually give things sounds and animations, and they handle all sorts of stuff like fog of war and randomization, and they can subsume all kinds of systems within the game. And whenever you're playing a tabletop game, basically your brain is the computer. You are your own CPU.
Yeah.
So that idea that you could entirely sort of take that part of having to work things out of people's hands, and they can just concentrate on playing the game. I had a great deal of I don't know, empathy towards that concept, because for me, mechanics should be ideally so smooth that they're kind of almost in the background. You play your game, the mechanics do their thing and so forth, but you're not really thinking about the numbers so much as what's purportedly happening. And it seemed to me like computer games had a direct line to that. In fact, by the way that they work, they're very intrinsic construction. So I was kind of really interested in them. And after Games Workshop, I didn't really have a plan at all. I diddled around. I did some freelance stuff. I did a Starship Troopers miniatures game, which was hilarious because it was the first time I'd done like a non D6 based 40k style game in 14 years. So I went mad with that. But I wasn't earning anywhere near enough money, basically, doing stuff like that. Trying to find my way freelancing for the first time, it's tough. So I also had a very young new wife who was American and who had moved to the UK to live with me and was not enjoying being in the UK at all because it's a tough transition. So I wrote a couple of letters, actually, is what I did, to Relic and to Blizzard, because they both had good reputations. I liked what they did, and said, hey, my name's Andy Chambers. I worked for 14 years at Games Workshop and I'm looking to do something else now. Would you be interested in talking to me? And they both were. God bless them. And eventually I took the gig at Blizzard rather than Relic, because they both offered me something as well, which just goes to show, folks, people are watching.
Yeah.
Because they knew who I was. They'd seen me in White Dwarf plenty and read my games and played some of them and things like that. As it turned out, when I got to meet them, a lot of them were, quiet 40k nerds or something like that. So they were absolutely prepared to give me a shot, and they did. Blizzard gave me a shot for 4 years, and in that time, I found out I knew nothing about making video games whatsoever. I learned some things about it, God bless them, and they were very patient with me. But ultimately, it wasn't something I could transition into, not into a really experienced team like they were, because they'd done, StarCraft before and Brood War and all the rest of it together, and they really knew their business, and I was just a complete nub.
Yeah.
So I made my contributions. I was actually creative director for a while, and then took lead writer on Wings of Liberty, squeezed that out. But I ended up basically freelancing again after that, as I realised, actually, I think my skill set is in writing games and books like I have been doing for the past 14 years, not in trying to be a writer and creative director on a video game. It was a lot of fun, and I met some lovely people doing it, and they were great to me, but it wasn't for me in the long term. But it was a great experience. And in its turn, because I learned a bit more along the way in terms of freelancing, I do freelancing on digital projects as well. Write scripts. I did the Necromunda game Road Factor did a little while ago. Wrote the script for that and stuff like that.
Oh, neat.
Also worked with Thomas Pirinen from back in the days of yore at Games Workshop Studio, because he's gone into digital gaming in a big way since then.
Oh, really?
Need for Speed and all kinds of stuff. Yeah. He's really well steeped in it. He lives back in Finland, and he's been working with. He's got his own game going now, actually, of course. He's got his own studio going. Digital games of different things, so I get work off him as well. Work with him on various things.
That's really cool. So, do you have any projects in the work coming up, or anything that you're just a passion projects that you're working on right now? Anything?
Yeah, I've actually been busy over the last couple of years. Most of my time's been dedicated to a new project that we're going to be announcing at Adepticon this year, which is a tabletop game. I don't know how much I should actually say other than that beforehand. But basically, if people are interested, if people enjoyed the old kind of like second edition 40k, that style of game, it's one that's pointed at them fairly pointedly, actually. And it's basically because a guy who also enjoyed great success in his own way has reached a point in his life where he's gone like, you know what I want to do? I want to fulfill my lifelong ambition of making a tabletop miniatures game. And I've been very happy to help him out. And I've hooked in Gav Thorpe as well, because we've worked together now on a number of different games after Games Workshop, through Warlord Games, who do Bolt Action, because they've also done 2000 AD games. And 2000 AD, to give some background, is a comic that's been published in the UK. You can probably get it in the States and Canada as well. But it's been published as a weekly comic. Get this, weekly comic since, I don't know, I was a kid, the 70s. And it's still going strong. Judge Dredd is from there. You've probably heard of the character Judge Dredd before now. And Gav the same, he was reading them in the schoolyard like I was. So basically, we got to make some games about these comic book characters we've been reading about in comics since we were kids, and that's been tremendous fun, absolutely tremendous, and great artwork as well, of course. Which the advantage of doing comic games, as we found, is like, oh wow! So if I need a piece of art for something, it's somewhere in these like 400 issues, it'll be there, and so on. And it's doing cars and stuff really easy. So we had a lot of fun doing those together, and he's working together with me on this new game we're going to announce at Adepticon as well. He's doing background, I'm doing rules. So we've got hopes for that, actually. It's been a lot of fun working on that, but it is very much we're building absolutely from the ground up. So we'll see how we get on.
That's got to be exciting.
The other thing that I've got, yeah, it's been great. Yeah, although we are literally on that point of like talking about logos and packaging design. The other thing that I do with World Games is Blood Red Skies, which is a World War II snuck back in again there, like mass fighter combat game. Because one of the things is coming out from the 70s and 80s and wargaming as it was then, I've got some scars from them, and one of them is about playing games, basically. Playing games where they all tend to be, I'll check my altitude and I'll pre-plot my movement, and zounds, if I manage to get onto your tail, I'll shoot you up. And I spent a year or so after I left Games Workshop, actually, supposedly freelancing, playing a game called World War II Online, which is basically like a mass simulator game where you can get in your tank simulator and go and fight men doing their men in simulators. And there are fighters and bombers in it as well. So, part one, if you want to fly, you have to kind of learn how to fly, in effect, of like flaps and getting your engine pitched to the right thing and all the rest of it, and locking your tail wheel before you take off. And then you get shot out of the sky where people have been doing it for years, and you gradually learn how to not get out of the sky, and maybe occasionally get to shoot someone else, and maybe occasionally a while after that shoot somebody else down. So I flew for about a year with the Luftwaffe, with the virtual Luftwaffe, and I can fly a Bf 109, and I can fly a Stuka, and I can fly an ME 110, sort of. But it's to do all that, basically, like I say, you had to learn to fly. And one of the pieces of advice you used to get on the forums is like, read Fighter Combat. I've got it over on my shelf somewhere. Which is a book basically which was written by the Top Gun School, guys at the Top Gun School. It's a real thing. It's not just a movie with Tom Cruise in it. And they put together all the lessons they could learn about, the science of air combat. Both piston engine fighters and guns, and then later moving on to jets and missile-based combat. Because it's a world where physics is king overall. You can go high, that's all well and good. You go down, you go faster, you go up, you go slower, that kind of thing. And the whole process of maneuvering is about understanding that and making that work to your advantage. Yeah. Through that, I started to think back on those tabletop games of yore that I'd played, stuff like Blue Max and things like that. And it's like, my experiences in the air, having learned these things and got into dogfights, were not that. There was nothing about pre-plotting or anything like that.
Yeah.
It was instinctive, it was fast, it was aggressive. Man and plane as one was when you worked best. So I wanted to make a system that narratively felt a bit more like that. The other thing is that when I read a lot of, there was a couple of years when I was up in Seattle after Blizzard, when I was freelancing, there was a used bookshop down the hill, which had a great variety of World War II, like biographies and things like that for ace pilots, and I assiduously read through them all. So these are the guys' own accounts of fighting in the air combat, and again, there was nothing very clinical, or sometimes they would plan a maneuver before executing it, yes, but once that was done, everything was up in the air, tits up, pretty much, and it was on the instinctual stuff again. And I wanted a game that felt more like that. And one day when I was in Seattle, my friend Ryan took me down to Beth's Diner, and we had some greasy food, and he said, if you could invent a game for yourself, what would you do? What would you make as a game for yourself? Which is a question I'd never been asked, because not since Firepower, basically, had I written a game for myself. Everything since then had been to a brief for a reason. So I was like, and it kind of came together that I'd been thinking about fighter combat games. I've been thinking about 3 levels of that 3D idea as well, about having 3 levels. And it kind of all came together, and I said, I'd do this sort of thing. And that was the genesis of writing Blood Red Skies, which is, I still believe, my best games design to date.
Really?
It's simple, it's elegant, it actually reflects air combat surprisingly well, to a fine degree of accuracy overall, given that all games are, at the end of the day, an abstraction of what's actually happening, because short of shooting guns at each other, you're not shooting guns at each other, really. But it does a good job. It does a good job, and it's massively simple to teach people as well, which is one of the things I always think of as being a good sign for a game. Is like, if you can teach someone to play it like within a few minutes, then you're off to a good start. And if once you've taught them to play, they start playing and then go like, huh? And have those light bulb moments.
Yeah.
Of like, I see how I can screw you over now, and things like that. You're in a really good place. And Blood Red Skies has done that really straightforwardly, so that's why I say I think it's my strongest design, and that's an ongoing concern. We did a new Battle of Midway starter set for that
Oh.
God, start of last year now. And there are a number of sort of like, models and so on attached to that. Wool's in the process of putting more into resin now because we had metal for a while, which is not ideal. Yeah, that's what
Metals.
these guys are for.
Oh,
These are resins.
nice.
So resin P40.
They look good.
They're really nice. This is one of the things as well. 3D design come on so far, and with something like a World War II fighter, the specs exist. Literal plans of it exist. So rendering a 3D model of that, well, actually, it's not quite as simple as you'd think, but can be done. And then that can be 3D printed, and then you can cast it into resin or just use 3D prints. God damn you all, because that's the reason I'm not making enough money out of Blood Red Skies. It is the blessing and the curse at the same time of like people can make their own Air Force overnight.
Oh, God, I know.
But it's a good little game. It's a good little game, and it's got a really dedicated community. I must put a shout out to those. The Leap Suit podcast specifically, if you're interested in that, and the Blood Red Skies Ready Room if you're on Facebook.
I am definitely interested as somebody who has way too many models and likes to look at way too many rule sets. It is definitely something that I am going to Google, and then the wife will get mad at me later for spending more money on something I don't need. But that whole shindig.
Yes. The process, as it's called.
Oh yeah. So, is there anything that you are playing right now? Are you in any tabletop games? Are you playing any war games on the regular? What are you doing for fun with the hobby?
I am role playing Friday nights in a campaign me and my friends have been playing in for, we're not quite sure how long at this point. We think it's about 28 years. Seriously.
How? I can't get
so that's my Friday commitment. It's partly the longevity is why we still do it, I think, quite apart from anything else. But no, credit to my GM on that one, the DM for it all, who puts together all the world and has regularly hosted his games at his house.
Oh, nice.
For umpty grump, more than 20 certainly years, easily more than 20, because he's been doing it since the late 90s.
Did you advance with the
we have our little characters.
Oh no,
it's not D&D.
Oh,
it's not D&D. Interestingly enough, it is actually based on get this a sort of like blend of chivalry and sorcery and Rolemaster.
That's an old title. What? So
they're both very old titles.
So is it like pretty much now like a homebrew system, or has it just
sort of, but no, there's a lot of like basically the magic system from Rolemaster is the core of where the magic comes from. So we are using literal Rolemaster spells, lists, and books, and so forth, and critical tables, and so on. But the stat system, is a homebrew from Chivalry and Sorcery as a basis. So like the base stat lines come from there, but some of how they're used and stuff like that is different. The skill system's different. The Chivalry and Sorcery systems are like pretty much unplayable, if I'm honest. So there are a number of quality of life improvements on that front.
No doubt. And even you saying like, oh yeah, it's a magic's based off Rolemaster, and I'm like, I've looked at a Rolemaster book and my eyes literally I at times I was like, okay, what am I reading again? That's also a very complicated system. That's a very technical system. Oh.
One of my complaints, I play a spellcaster, and one of my complaints is that I literally have like, I don't know, a book like this thick with spells. I have 250 plus individual spells. So yes, when I'm not perhaps Johnny on the spot being able to remember which one to pull out first,
and
I do believe I require some forgiveness for that.
And it's been the same characters that you've been playing, or have you had different characters? Like
no, been playing the same character throughout.
Like they're legal to drink it almost in pretty much the entire world. That character, like,
yes, it's true. Just how?
Yes, I'm trying to think how. Like, that like
All right,
it's really
I'll give
cool.
you an example of how it's dedication from the DM.
Yeah.
I can tell you that right here and now. When I moved to the US to work for Blizzard,
Hmm.
and I was away potentially, forever.
Yeah.
He continued to send me character updates of like what happened weekly with the party through email. Okay, sometimes he'd wait and send every 2 weeks, but
Yeah.
he kept me updated on what was happening in the game through regular emails. And then when I came and visited home, like every 6 months to a year, I'd come
Yeah.
back to the UK and visit my folk and stuff like that. And I'd go over to his place and we'd have an intense like couple of days solo playing as well. So my character was still doing things within the campaign, even though I was living at that time 6,000 miles away. And I say, eventually, 2011, we actually moved back to the UK. I hadn't planned to, but my mum was very ill. Didn't sound like she had long to go. All this sort of stuff. So we moved back, and I kind of rejoined the game at that point. But I'd already been doing stuff and had history all the way up to that point. Had some marvelous solo adventures. Actually, thank you very much. Going cast back into the party.
That is like that's super cool. Like I've never had a game last more than 6 sessions, and here you are with. I'm jealous. I don't know what else to say. I'm jealous of that. That's
have I evoked your jealousy?
a little bit
I
jealous.
suppose, yeah.
Wow,
Yeah. Weekly sessions, if you say we miss some occasionally.
No.
So 50, say 50 a year, because we're actually pretty good about it. So yeah, 20 years, 1,000 sessions.
That is intense. Wow. That is, I'm not gonna lie. I've never heard someone with a campaign that runs so long, and that is so freaking cool. You guys could write a book on
Like
it. You could write a book just.
We'll resist that temptation. My friend who plays, he had a few years out as well, but he didn't keep a diary. But he's been keeping a diary through the whole thing.
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
He shares it with the DM, but not with the rest of us.
Oh, that's super super cool. Yeah. So I got one final question for you here.
Mm-hmm.
If someone is either trying to get into the industry or trying to write their own game, whether it be tabletop RPGs or war games, what would be one bit of advice that you feel like would be the most important to give them?
Do the second part first. As in, if you've got a yen to write a game of any description or even an adaptation of an existing game, it all counts.
Yeah.
Do that. Do that a lot. Then ask people about getting into the industry. Trying to jump straight in, I mean, it could work, I guess. The biggest thing that struck me over the past, because like I said, I've touched a few times on how more interconnected we all are now. In many ways, it's much, much easier to make an impact in the world now. You can reach thousands of people easily.
Very true.
Tens of thousands without much effort. So it's much easier to get yourself out there in the world now, but at the same time, everyone else can do the same thing. So if you want to be in a position where you can go to a company and say like, oh, hey, you guys should give me a job, it's always good to have a portfolio of something.
Yeah.
Something you've worked on, whether it's cooperating with somebody else, something you've done off your own back, preferably all of the above. Work on that, because otherwise you're kind of setting yourself up for disappointment, because companies that can hire people, they have a lot of people come to them who say, I would like to do stuff with you, because at the end of the day, we're all not motivated by money. We're motivated by wanting to do it, by passion. So your passion is going to be up against everybody else's, and whatever competence level you have, that counts for a lot as well. Of course, what skills you have, that's huge, particularly technical skills. Although perhaps I overrate them since I have none. But yeah, you're in a field of many, so try and work on things that you can say, this is my own, or this is the thing I did, and so on. And like I say, it doesn't have to be 100%, oh, I came up with this brilliant idea. People think ideas are precious and valuable in themselves, and they're not.
Yeah.
People have ideas all the time. What counts is taking your idea and doing something with it, growing that seed into something more, showing people that you can grow a seed into something more. And I think that's what they caught when I did that first little article back in White Dwarf back in the day. It's like, oh, this guy gets it. Basically, he can see what we've done,
Yeah.
and he's mimicked it to some extent, and he can do the numbers thing, and we should give him a go because he gets it, and he's at least tried to integrate what we're doing with what he's done,
Yeah.
something completely off the wall. So I think, and it's poor advice these days because I don't know, if I'm honest, how you get a job doing the kind of thing that I do, except how I did it back in the day, which is, it's like trying to put straw in your engine, really, because it's a different world now. But you can be in a position now where you can actually build up a system, build up some followers without being part of a company.
Yeah.
So consider that possibility and make use of it. Use that fact that you can interconnect with so many different people, and there's so many wonderful people out there willing to help, interested to get on board. It'll also introduce you to the horrors of working with other people, which you need to be able to do if you're going to work in professionally in industry or what have you. You have to work with other people all the time. I'm bad at it. That's why I freelance. But it's a skill that you have to learn as well, especially if it doesn't come naturally. And I'll be honest, a lot of the guys who are most into role playing or tabletop games, let's be honest, social skills aren't necessarily our top flight. That's why we like to have rules for our interactions, be it role playing games or tabletop. So it's learning the rules for the other interactions, the social rules that go beyond that as well.
Nice.
So there you go, all of that.
Why? Well, I gotta say,
you can do it.
Yeah, you can do it. Yeah, I have
believe in yourself. You can do it.
That's very good advice. I'd like to thank you so much for joining me today. This has been honestly really fun. I've learned things that I didn't actually know. So yeah, this is I thank you very much, Andy, for hopping on, and you're welcome back anytime you want. This has been fan-freaking-tastic.
Yeah, my absolute pleasure. It'd be nice to come back to you and after Adepticon, which is March 22nd, I think it is, so I can talk to you about this new game that's coming out with a clear conscience.
You can definitely. I want
models together and things.
I would love for that to happen. I am very curious. You've piqued my interest and just dangled it in front of me without being able to tell me anything, and it's. I'm a slightly.
It's like I'm some old pro, isn't it? Yeah.
I am slightly of an obsessive person, and when I can't gather that information, it's like something in my mind just is like, you can try and dig a little deeper. You can try and dig. It's like, but there's nothing out there right now. I know there isn't. But again, Andy, thank you very much. To all the people listening, thank you very much for tuning in. I hope you guys enjoyed this. If you have any questions for the next time Andy's on, put it in the wow, sorry. I'm screwing. The comments below. How did I forget that word? Put it in the comments below.
And editing exists.
Oh, God, I'm getting used to this YouTube game. It's like the first video is being posted out actually technically today, so it's exciting for myself. But yeah, thank you very much. You can either send me an email at rpsmartpeople@gmail.com if you would rather do it that way, or if Twitter still exists by the time this video is up, you can send me a tweet on Twitter at rpsmartpeople@gmail.com. And any links that Andy would like to put in, I'll throw that in as well in the description. Thank you very much and have a great day. Bye.